This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Jesus! Hold the gun on here!
Yeah, but, yeah.
Stay calm! Get up! In there!
It was a foggy night, the 8th of February 1983. At about 8:30, a Ford Granada pulled off the main Dublin road, and drove through the gates of the Ballymenny Stud. The men inside were dressed as officers from the Garda. They had pistols, a submachine gun, and a well-rehearsed plan.
Their plan? To kidnap Ballymenny's resident superstar, the most famous and most expensive racehorse in the world.
We've come for Shergar.
Don't do anything, and everything will be all right.
The kidnappers had a cunning plan. It was a daring plan, but it did not go precisely as they planned.
Ride the horse now.
I'm Rob. You may know me as Vanilla Ice, and you're listening to Sport's Strangest Crimes, the real story of Shergar the Superhorse. Episode 2, Thieves in the Night. Okay, to kick us off, let's go back to where the mystery begins, to the 1980s, to County Kildare in the Republic of Ireland.
Tuesday, February the 8th, 1983.
February the 8th, 1983 was one of the worst days for weather in all of Ireland in all of the year. There was rain, there was sleet, there was fog. It was just a miserable evening.
This is Milton Toby. We'll call him Milt. He's a Kentucky-based equine journalist and writer.
At around 8:30 in the evening, a gang of armed men walked through an unlocked gate at Ballymenny Stud.
Ballymenny Stud was and still is a thoroughbred breeding farm owned by billionaire spiritual leader, the Aga Khan. It was home to Shergar and the large number of stable staff, including James Fitzgerald, better known as Jim, who lived there with his wife and their children.
Well, you had the people who worked in the stud who were there and looked after these horses on a daily basis.
Mick Fitzgerald, BBC racing journalist.
You know, the head man at the stud, he got knock on the door late at night. You opened the door, he was met by guys in balaclavas with guns.
Is the boss man in?
Dad! Hold the gun on here!
The kidnappers pushed roughly past Jim's teenage son Bernard as they opened the door.
Yeah, but, yeah.
Stay calm!
The gang were heavily armed with pistols and machine guns, and their identity was hidden behind ski masks. The masked raiders put a gun to Jim's head.
Sit down.
And Jim did what he was told.
Well, they say they'd come to take Shergar, and I was to load her in the horse box for them, which I did.
He was basically taken down, show me the horse. The horse was loaded up and away.
The gang kidnapped both Shergar and the groom.
Say I have to go with them.
He was bundled into the next car and driven away.
Don't do anything, and your daddy will be back.
And his wife and kids were being held to ransom.
Imagine being taken from your home in the middle of the night.
It's how we got through it, I don't know.
I'll ring tomorrow. The code word is King Neptune.
We want 2 million. He's worth more. No police or the horse is dead. Do you understand me?
Jim Fitzgerald in a car went one way. Shergar in a car pulling a trailer went the other way.
Milt Toby again.
The amazing thing about all of this is that there was no security when Shergar was stolen. And again, it's because no one thought that this would ever happen. You know, if you've never had a valuable horse stolen, you tend not to lock the gate. You don't think it's necessary. Kildare, it's an agricultural county, and horses are the primary agricultural product there. The Curragh Racecourse, which is the largest racecourse in Ireland, is in County Kildare. It also has Ballymanny and most of the leading studs. Kildare is the place to be if you want to be in the horse community. And Ballymanny Stud, where Shergar was standing, is literally next door to the Curragh Racecourse. It's a beautiful farm. There's a quarter-mile road, trees overhanging that take you back to the working part of the farm. The stallion barn is a 4-stall barn. The stalls are about 20 foot by 20 foot square. Very roomy, very nice. On the other side of the farm road are the barns for the broodmares. It's just a spectacularly pretty place. The Ballymanny Stud was an essential part of the economy, but no one expected people to just walk through an unlocked gate and drive away with a $10 million horse.
With his eyes covered, Jim was forced to lay down on the floor of the getaway van.
Down.
He had absolutely no idea where they were going or if he would ever see his family again.
I imagine that the kidnapping was extremely frightening for the groom because of the association of the balaclavaed face, the being grabbed, being taken away in the night. It would be for anyone, but especially in this context, because of the group of people called the Disappeared.
Dr. Gemma Clark, Irish historian.
These are people who were abducted, murdered, and secretly buried by Republicans, by the Provisional IRA, the Republican paramilitaries during the period of the Troubles. The first of those were taken in 1972 and the last in 1985. So in 1983, when Shergar was kidnapped, this would very much have been in the mind of anyone who lives in the country and who went through such a terrifying experience. It's unclear on what basis some of these people were selected. It could be a case of being suspected of being a spy, of giving information to the British, or to the loyalist authorities. But these are civilians who are targeted, including women, and some of these people are sadly still missing. Work is continuing with the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains, established as part of the peace process in the late 1990s.
This was a desperate time in Irish history. The style of the attack at Ballymanny, the police uniforms, ski masks, weaponry, had all the hallmarks of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army.
Difficult to sum it up in just a few sentences.
Ed Maloney, journalist, author, and leading authority on the IRA.
Essentially, it was one of the most violent periods in Irish history, very violent period in British history. It started in the late 1960s and continued all the way to 1998, and some people would argue that in some way it still hasn't been finally settled, but essentially it was a conflict that started as a civil rights movement by Catholics living in Northern Ireland who complained that they weren't getting fair treatment in terms of jobs, houses, right to vote and stuff like that. And it just spiraled out of control, and by the summer of 1969, British troops were sent in to, quote, keep the peace, end quote. But they, of course, eventually were forced to or were put in a position where they took sides, and that started a war between themselves and the IRA, which up until that point had been more or less a moribund organization, but came back to life. And we had the best part of 25 years of bombings and shootings and killings, and enormous number of people killed, terms of the population, I mean, something like 3,000 to 4,000 people died. 30,000, 40,000 people were wounded. Now that's, objectively, in terms of what's happening in major conflicts, not a huge number, but in terms of the size of Northern Ireland, it was a huge proportion of the population were affected directly by the Troubles. So it was this very, very scary, violent period in Anglo-Irish history.
Many people who were taken at night, like Jim Fitzgerald, simply permanently disappeared. So there was a very real basis for Jim's terror. Shergar was in dire straits, but for very different reasons. Since he had been retired from racing to breed, his famous lovely personality had altered. He was now focused on sex, not on sport. Claire Balding, commentator and horse expert, explains.
What tends to happen with racehorses is that even if they have been really mild-mannered in training, and they're not always, colts can be quite difficult, when they become stallions, and this certainly happened with Mill Reef, who my father trained, who won the Derby, and the King George actually, but he became quite... they get the testosterone is flowing through their bodies, let's put it that way, and they can become quite macho and alpha and aggressive. So it is difficult to handle a stallion, and it's a very, it takes people with a lot of horse sense and who understand how horses behave. So for those kidnappers who took Shergar, I suspect he scared them quite a lot, because he wouldn't have, it's not like taking a donkey or a pony. He's going to lash out. He could kick and bite and certainly rear up and resist being led into a trailer, which is how we think they got him away. It's a crazy thing to take on, and you'd only take it on if you had no idea how a horse might behave. Because if you understood that, you just wouldn't do it. We are talking about a fully fledged, testosterone-fueled stallion, a big, strong horse who is surrounded by people who he doesn't know, and they don't know horses.
Ride the horse, ride the pony. Saddle up, baby, go wild on this donkey.
Word amongst horse people is that a stallion is a prick on legs in more ways than one. As I mentioned in the last episode of this podcast, Shergar's value, his real financial value, wasn't in the race-winning legs, but in his sperm and his capability to father an offspring that would inherit some of the race-winning DNA. And the only way for a racehorse to breed was in person, or rather in horse, face-to-face or muzzle-to-muzzle.
Ride the horse now, ride the horse, ride the horse, ride the horse now.
The rules on thoroughbred breeding are very, very strict, and you have to physically, or the horses have to physically meet, and the mare has to physically be covered, is what they call it, but basically mounted and mated, and there cannot be any artificial insemination, and therefore you can't do it remotely. Now, in other sports, in show jumping, in dressage, in eventing, they use artificial insemination. In some sports, polo, for example, they use cloning. I've seen polo ponies, 6 clones of the same brilliant mare. In Argentina, I saw that, and it's extraordinary. And in camel racing, they do a lot of embryo transfer and artificial insemination, because the female camels tend to be the better racing cows, and their gestation period is so long that you'd have to take them off the racecourse and wait years before you'd find out whether their offspring were anywhere near as good as them. So they do embryo transfer and artificial insemination into a surrogate, and then continue that line artificially, as it were. Well, not artificially, but certainly not with natural birth. And with thoroughbred racing, it's to do with protecting the value, but also the integrity of the breed. And you don't want your best stallions covering 2,000 mares or 10,000 mares a year. You want numbers to be limited, and the only way you can limit them is by restricting it to physical breeding. The disappointing aspect of that is when a great stallion dies, like Sadler's Wells was probably the best in the world and the most successful in the world. When he died, and there's a taxidermied, representation of him in a museum in Ireland. That was it. There can be no more horses that are the sons or daughters of Sadler's Wells. And with Shergar, it was even more disappointing because he had so little time at stud that really there were hardly any offspring of Shergar. Whereas if they'd been able to store a whole load of frozen semen in a factory somewhere, there could have been still hundreds and thousands of baby Shergars running around today.
1982 was Shergar's first year at stud, and he covered 35 mares at 80,000 pounds a pop. Whew. He had 53 lined up for the 1983 breeding season that begins in February. Quick math, that's 4.4 million pounds, money that would be lost if Shergar wasn't returned to Balmainey stud safely. That's one heck of an incentive to get the horse back in one piece.
Ride the horse now. Ride the horse, ride the horse, ride the horse.
As his groom and friend, Jim Fitzgerald was acutely aware of the danger Shergar could be in.
He loves carrots.
Jim was overheard saying anxiously,
Shergar really loves carrots. Give him a carrot. That'll calm him down for sure.
A tussle with men unfamiliar with stallions in a small horse box with no access to a vet. It could mean a struggle, a broken leg, and curtains. So if Shergar was the target, why did they kidnap the groom too?
I think that they kidnapped Jim Fitzgerald to protect themselves from an early report to the authorities.
Milt Toby again.
Because the trick to make all this work is to get away, and to get away quickly.
The car carrying Jim drove around and around winding country roads for over 2 hours, then stopped beside the village of Kilcock. Was it to be freedom for Jim or an unmarked grave?
You ring your boss. Tell him what I told you. Tell him the police must be kept out of it.
It's easy to forget that in 1983 there were no mobile phones. And at that time in rural Ireland, public phone boxes were rare too.
He got to a phone, called a relative. The relative took him back to Ballymanny. It's now about midnight.
Hello. What? I'll be with you immediately.
At midnight, Stan Cosgrove contacts Ghislaine Drion, who is the Irish stud manager for the Aga Khan. He managed several farms in Ireland. And they both went to the stallion barn at Ballymanny Stud, and they stood there and looked at the empty stall where Shergar was. And they didn't know what to do. They had never encountered a situation like this. So Stan Cosgrove calls a friend, Captain Sean Barry, who was head of the Irish Thoroughbred Breeders Association, and asked for the phone number of a friend. That was all he said. Captain Barry gave him the phone number and angrily went back to bed, went back to sleep. A few minutes later, Stan Cosgrove calls Sean Barry again. This time he says Shergar's been stolen. This got Captain Barry's attention. He immediately got dressed, immediately drove to Stan Cosgrove's house. He got there, around 4 o'clock in the morning on the 9th. There was a world of activity going on.
Jim calls his bosses to alert them that Shergar has been taken. A mass chaotic telephone ring-around began. The stud manager, the Aga Khan staff in Paris, Ireland, and Switzerland, even members of the Irish Parliament were contacted.
I'm Alan Dukes. At the material time, in Ireland, beginning of February 1983. I was Minister for Finance.
Alan Dukes, MP for Ballymanny.
The first I knew about it was when my phone rang at about 3 o'clock in the morning. I struggled out of bed and lifted the phone to be talked to by the late Stan Cosgrove, a vet of international renown and a fairly close neighbour, and Sean Berry, who's a neighbour who lives less than 2 miles away from me. And they were highly distressed. They told me that Shergar had been stolen and they wondered what to do. I couldn't figure out what to advise them, apart from saying that they should immediately call the police, the Garda Síochána, or police force. And if I remember correctly, they said to me that there had been a message to say that there would be very serious consequences if the police were informed. It struck me that's the kind of thing that people threaten to do in these circumstances. It turned out that one of the people working in the stud had been threatened with dire consequences if the police were informed. But I said, look, there's no other way of dealing with this. And to assure them of, the kind of attention the issue would get, I gave them the telephone number of my colleague who was Minister for Justice, which also allowed me to go back to bed because I had to deliver a budget on the following afternoon, so I had a heavy day in prospect. But they rang the Minister for Justice, and immediately he alerted the guards, and an investigation began.
So things got passed around a lot at the beginning, in addition to the 8-hour delay. Because of the weather, they couldn't go very fast. And if there had been reports very quickly to the authorities that this horse had been stolen, we might be having a different story today. But that didn't happen.
Unlucky for Shergar's pursuers and for the horse, despite him having 4 lucky shoes. Was this part of the kidnapper's clever plan, or a case of luck?
As it turned out, there was a major sale at Goff's, which is one of the leading bloodstock auction companies in Ireland, the same day. And there were lots of trailers on the road. There was no reason to be suspicious. The trailer that was carrying Shergar would just vanish in a mass of trailers. It was almost a perfect storm for stealing the horse.
A perfect storm for the villains. For the heroes, not so much.
It wasn't until after 4 o'clock in the morning when the authorities were finally notified that Shergar had been stolen. That was almost 8 hours after he had been taken. And even with the bad roads, the bad weather, driving at a moderate speed, an 8-hour head start would allow the thieves to reach almost anywhere in the Republic of Ireland and also to cross the border into Northern Ireland. Everything that happened after the theft revolves around this 8-hour gap. The 8 hours that made all the difference in the world.
Finally, they tracked the Aga Khan down in Switzerland. He was told that his prize horse was gone, and the kidnappers wanted £2 million for ransom to bring him back. Would he pay? Was it too late to save Shergar the £10 million super horse? Next time on Sport's Strangest Crimes, the real story of Shergar the super horse. The police step in, the media frenzy begins. But 8 hours had passed. 8 vital hours. Each hour giving the kidnappers more of an advantage. Each hour taking Shergar further away into the darkness of the night. Was it 8 hours too much? Would Shergar ever be brought back home?
How did the Aga Khan come to acquire the horse in the first place?
Well, in very controversial circumstances.
There is, of course, the possibility that this might be a vendetta, someone holding a grudge against the Aga Khan.
Sport's Strangest Crimes, the real story of Shergar the Superhorse, was presented by me, Vanilla Ice. It was produced by Lucy Ditchmont, music and production by Edwin Pearson, mixed by Dave Dodd, executive producer Rabina Pabani. This is an ITN production for BBC Sounds.
BBC Sounds, the Euros.
He scuffed it, but it's the best scuff you will ever see.
Hear live coverage of every single game on 5 Live.
That is absolutely outstanding.
And in the Euros Daily Podcast, get all the goss on the day's biggest stories with the latest analysis, interviews and debate.
How were they competing, given that they were up against one of the tournament favourites?
Take the Euros with you on the BBC Sounds app.
Want the high-stakes stuff? The believe the hype stuff? The criminally good, emotional roller coaster, can't believe what you're seeing stuff? You know, the good stuff. AMC Plus has it all. Can't wait for the beginning of the end? Watch all new episodes of The Walking Dead 1 week early. Want to be chilled to the core? Set sail with the North Water, a thrilling Arctic drama starring Jack O'Connell and Colin Farrell. Plus, uncover gripping true crime content ad-free and on demand. Expect the epic with AMC Plus. Sign up today at amcplus.com. AMC Plus, only the good stuff.